August 10, 1994, Vancouver, British Columbia. 55-year-old Nick Masee and his 39-year-old wife, Lisa Masee, claim they're planning to meet a potential investor about a $10 million business deal. But after making a reservation at a local restaurant, no one shows up. The following morning, Lisa makes some phone calls to say that she and Nick are leaving town for a few days, but the couple is never heard from again. A pair of plastic zip ties are found near the front door of the Masee residence to suggest that a kidnapping may have taken place, but no trace of Nick or Lisa is ever found. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be traveling back to our podcast's home country of Canada to cover an unsolved missing persons case involving a married couple from British Columbia, the 1994 disappearances of Nick and Lisa Masee. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Maria Gabriella, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Maria. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 7 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. So today's case is the baffling story of a couple who inexplicably vanished without a trace, as Nick Masee was a retired banker who had started working for a publicly traded company and was supposedly planning to meet up with an unidentified individual who may have been interested in a $10 million investment. While a reservation was made at Nick's favorite restaurant, no one showed up, but the following morning, Lisa made a pair of calls from Nick's cell phone in which she claimed that she and Nick were planning to leave town for a few days. Well, this was the last time anyone ever heard from the Masees, and since a pair of zip ties would be found outside the couple's residence, this seemed to suggest that they may have been kidnapped. Since Nick crossed paths with some shady characters during his time as a banker, there's been speculation that he may have become involved in something which led to him and Lisa being killed. But on the other hand, there's some people, including a private investigator hired by Nick's children, who believe that the Masees may have disappeared voluntarily and started a new life. Whatever the case, we recently passed the 30-year anniversary of their disappearances, and there's no conclusive evidence to prove that Nick or Lisa lived past August of 1994, so I thought now would be a good time to put together an episode about their case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as low as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearances of Nick and Lisa Masee. Our story begins in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1994, and our two victims are 55-year-old Nick Masee and his 39-year-old wife Lisa Masee, whom he has been married to for 10 years. Nick was born in the Netherlands before he immigrated to Canada and has two grown children from a previous marriage. At this particular point, his son, Nick Jr., lives in Singapore, while his daughter Tanya lives in the Netherlands. Lisa also has one prior marriage under her belt, and she originally met Nick when he got a haircut from her at Yokoi Hair Design, a salon where she continues to remain employed. In January of 1994, Nick retired from his job as a senior private account manager for the Bank of Montreal, as he had worked for them for 37 years and handled the banking for a number of wealthy clients, many of whom were major players on the Vancouver Stock Exchange, aka the VSE. Following his retirement, Nick became co-director of a publicly traded engineering company called Turbodyne Technologies Incorporated, which was in the midst of developing a power booster system for diesel engines in order to cut down on smoke emissions. Nick works at a Vancouver-based office, and his responsibilities include looking after the corporate budget and setting up evaluations for their anti-pollution device. On August the 10th, Nick received a phone call from a friend of his who invited Nick and Lisa to join him to watch the Symphony of Fireworks display in English Bay. However, Nick had to decline because he said he had an appointment scheduled with a man over a potential business deal, as this guy supposedly needed some assistance with investing $10 million, and Nick was going to convince him to invest it in Turbodyne. According to Nick's friend, he never mentioned this man's name, only that he was some old contact from the Bank of Montreal and was going to send a limousine to pick up Nick and Lisa from the residence to bring them to dinner. Well, that same afternoon, Lisa was working at Yokoi Hair Design and told her co-workers the same story about Nick being approached by an investor who was sending a limousine to pick them up for dinner. Nick had initially planned on meeting this man alone, but since he was going to bring his own wife along, Nick had called Lisa at the salon and asked her to accompany him that night. All Lisa knew about the investor was that he was from California and had apparently met Nick while he was working at the Bank of Montreal. However, Nick apparently had no recollection of him, and Lisa even told one of her colleagues that this guy, quote-unquote, seemed too good to be true. Well, shortly before 10 a.m. the following morning, Lisa called Leon Nowak, Nick's co-director at Turbodyne Technologies Incorporated, to let him know that she and Nick were going to be out of town for a few days. Leon would later say that the whole situation struck him as very unusual, as it was out of character for Nick to leave town without planning things well in advance, and he would ordinarily not get Lisa to phone Leon about work issues on his behalf. Regardless, Leon did not believe Lisa showed any signs of distress when she spoke to him, but when he attempted to phone Nick only a half hour after Lisa's call, he could not reach him. Leon would continue attempting to call both Nick's home phone and cell phone without success, and Nick never phoned Leon back. That same morning, Lisa called her boss at Yokoi Hair Design and shared the same story about her and Nick leaving town for a few days, and mentioned something about being called away for a court case which suddenly came up. Lisa said she expected to be back at work the following Tuesday, August the 16th, but after the call ended, this turned out to be the last time either of the Masees were confirmed to be alive. Over the course of the next week, no one heard from the couple, and Lisa did not show up for work as planned on the 16th, even though it was very out of character for her to miss a shift without calling in. Finally, on August the 19th, Lisa's sister Loretta became concerned enough to visit the Masee residence, which was located on Monterey Avenue in North Vancouver. When Loretta arrived, she discovered that the house was unlocked, and Nick's unlocked Chrysler LeBaron convertible was still parked in the driveway. The alarm system had also not been set, which was uncharacteristic since Nick was known for being very security conscious. Most disturbingly, a pair of plastic zip ties were on the ground by the front door, which suggested that the couple may have been bound and abducted from the residence. This prompted Loretta to contact the North Vancouver detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, aka the RCMP, in order to officially report Nick and Lisa missing. While there were no signs of any struggle or violence inside the Masee residence, all of their personal belongings, including their passports, were left behind, and there would be no further activity on their bank accounts. In addition, their pet black cat Spider was also left at the house, and he had not been fed in days. Since Nick had owned Spider for 17 years and was very attached to the animal, it seemed unlikely that he would have taken off without him. Investigators learned that on the evening of August the 10th, Nick had made a reservation for 4 for 8:30 p.m. that night at his favorite restaurant, Trader Vic's, which was located at the Westin Bayshore Hotel in the Cole Harbor neighborhood. Nick had been a regular customer there for years, and this seemed to support the story that he and Lisa were planning to have dinner with an investor and his wife. At some point that night, Nick phoned the dining room supervisor at Trader Vic's to say he would be delayed, but when he failed to show up by 9:30, Vic's table was given to someone else. At no point did Nick call to officially cancel his reservation, which the staff felt was very uncharacteristic since he was known for being punctual. As you recall, Nick and Lisa both claimed that the investor had arranged to send a limousine to pick them up from the residence, but there were no records of any rented limos or any taxi cabs having gone there that night. Oddly, even though the Masees never showed up at Trader Vic's, there were other witnesses who recalled seeing Nick and Lisa between 6:30 and 10:30 p.m. on the evening of the 10th in the Garden Lounge, another establishment at the Westin Bayshore. They said that Nick was dressed in a jogging suit, and the couple were sharing a bottle of wine, but as far as I can tell, they were not seen in the company of any other individuals, and Nick's mysterious investor was never identified. It also turned out that Lisa's phone calls to Leon Nowak and Yokoi Hair Design on the morning of August the 11th had been made from Nick's cell phone. Even though the Masees lived in North Vancouver, phone records showed that these calls were rerouted through a repeater on Bowen Island, which is located off the coast of West Vancouver, meaning that these calls could have originated from West Point Grey neighborhood or the Sunshine Coast Regional District. In the weeks following the Masees' disappearance, an attempt was made to break into the residence, but since the alarm went off, the responsible party fled the scene before the police arrived, and nothing wound up being stolen. It was unclear if this break-in was connected to the case, or if it was simply done by an opportunist who learned about the couple's disappearance in the media and knew their house would be unoccupied, so they attempted to take advantage of the situation. Nick's son, Nick Masee Jr., traveled from Singapore to Vancouver to help search for his father, as he had spoken to Nick Sr. on the phone a few days before he went missing, and he apparently never gave off any indication that he was planning to go anywhere. Nick Jr. wound up hiring a private investigator named Ozzie Caban, and if that name sounds familiar, that's because Ozzie Caban was heavily involved in the Cindy James case, which was featured on episode number 18 of The Trail Went Cold. Caban was the most prominent private investigator in Vancouver during that time period, and Nick Jr. felt that certain people might feel more comfortable speaking to Caban about his father's case rather than speaking with the police. Even though the Masees were well known in Vancouver's social circle and had a number of friends and business associates, they did not appear to have any known enemies. However, during his time working as a private account manager for the Bank of Montreal, Nick Sr. had done business with a number of controversial stock promoters, some of whom would become embroiled in illegal activity. Naturally, there was speculation that Nick may have uncovered something that endangered his life, as one of his former clients, Murray Pezim, told the press, quote, "He knew everything about the street, but he had no street smarts. He might have got himself into the wrong place at the wrong time," end quote. However, even though Nick had a number of wealthy clients, he lived a fairly modest middle-class lifestyle, and when he retired from banking, his salary had only been around $80,000 to $85,000 per year. It's been reported that the Masees have been living beyond their means and had some debt when they vanished, but no evidence could be found to indicate that Nick ever did anything illegal. Another former client of Nick's named Herb Capozzi once stated, quote, "He's straight as an arrow. He's the kind of guy that if he won money in a poker game, he would claim it on his income tax," end quote. One particularly controversial client of Nick's was a stock promoter named Harry Mall, who had created a public holding company called the Pine Ridge Capital Corporation, which wound up collapsing in 1992 when millions of dollars went missing. The whole thing prompted the Premier of British Columbia to launch a commission of inquiry into regulation of the Vancouver Stock Exchange, who blacklisted Mall. Since Mall had once controlled Turbodyne Technologies Incorporated, VCE officials only allowed Nick to start working there after he signed an undertaking which stated that he would have nothing to do with Mall. In spite of this, one rumor which circulated is that Maul had run up some gambling debts at a Las Vegas casino, and Nick may have inadvertently endangered his own life when he made a verbal guarantee that these debts would be paid off. The debts were supposedly later sold off to a local biker gang who proceeded to kidnap the Masees in order to collect a ransom, but no evidence was ever found to support this theory. Now, you might recall that when Lisa made her final phone call to Yokoi Hair Design, she claimed that she and Nick had been called out of town for a court case. While there was nothing to indicate this was true, Nick had been subpoenaed to testify at a trial which was scheduled to begin in October of that year. The defendant was another former client of Nick's named Nelson Scalbania, who had been charged with theft after taking a $100,000 down payment from a prospective real estate partner and transferring the money out of a trust fund in order to pay off some personal debts. Scalbania was a prominent businessman who was heavily involved in real estate flipping and purchasing and selling sports franchises. In fact, in 1978, Scalbania had been the owner of the Indianapolis Racers of the World Hockey Association when he signed a 17-year-old prospect named Wayne Gretzky, who was later sold to the Edmonton Oilers. Of course, the World Hockey Association eventually folded, and the Oilers were absorbed into the National Hockey League, where Gretzky went on to become the greatest hockey player of all time. Nick was slated to be a witness for the Crown at Scalbania's trial, but his disappearance wound up causing the trial to be postponed until May of 1995, after Scalbania's lawyers said they needed Nick for their defense. Even though Nick never resurfaced, the trial still went ahead as planned, and while Scalbania was acquitted, the Crown wound up successfully appealing the verdict. Scalbania was convicted at a second trial and received a 1-year prison sentence, but after a number of prominent friends testified on his behalf, he was able to avoid serving any time behind bars and instead spent a year on parole while wearing an ankle monitor. Even though Nick's disappearance did cause a 6-month delay with Scalbania's trial, he was only considered to be a minor witness, so nothing could be found to indicate that the two events were connected. Another notorious figure who did business with Nick was Fred Hoffman, a Dutch-born accountant who disappeared in 1991 after embezzling $9.7 million of his clients' money. Many of Hoffman's clients were elderly people who had entrusted him to invest their life savings, and in fact, Nick had personally introduced Hoffman to a retired anesthesiologist from Seattle, Washington, who wound up having nearly $3 million of his own money stolen. In 1993, Hoffman was charged with 60 counts of theft and fraud, and an arrest warrant was issued, and he had still not been found by the time Nick went missing. Once again, there was no indication that Nick had done anything illegal or had any involvement in Hoffman's embezzlement, but Ozzy Caban started making cryptic statements to the press about how the two men might be hiding out together somewhere. You see, in April of 1994, 4 months before they vanished, Nick and Lisa had made a trip to the Cayman Islands, where they opened up a bank account containing $50,000 worth of stock. The money had been transferred to some lawyers' accounts and was subsequently invested in trust. Due to confidentiality laws, the RCMP could not find out why these transactions took place, but they did learn that the Masees drew up new wills during their trip to the Caymans. The couple often took trips to Maui since they had a timeshare condo there and had even visited Maui for a month following Nick's retirement, but their trip to the Caymans was completely unexpected. Before he left, Nick had phoned his daughter Tanya in the Netherlands to let her know he would be out of town on her birthday, April the 23rd, and unable to call her. He specifically said he could not tell Tanya where he was going, and neither he nor Lisa told anyone about their plans to travel to the Cayman Islands until after they returned. Even though Nick was known for being very outgoing when it came to talking about his personal life, Tanya claimed that her father became a lot more guarded during the 6 months prior to his disappearance, and he seemed concerned about his personal safety. In fact, on August the 9th, the day before he vanished, Nick attended a friend's funeral, and he apparently looked distraught and told someone he was planning to leave town. Even though the couple's families and the RCMP believed that Nick and Lisa had become the victims of foul play, Ozzy Caban started publicly expressing his belief that the couple had taken off voluntarily and were still alive somewhere, which led to Caban having a falling out with the Masee family. At one point, Nick Jr. even agreed to undergo a polygraph test in which he denied having any contact with his father since he disappeared or having any knowledge of his whereabouts, and Nick Jr. wound up passing. In the years following Nick's disappearance, Turbodyne Technologies Incorporated would send out a series of misleading press releases which greatly inflated their stock price. This captured the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission and led to the company incurring some heavy fines, but in spite of this, there was nothing to indicate that Nick had ever acted improperly during his time working at Turbodyne. By October of 2001, Nick and Lisa had been missing for 7 years, and since there was no evidence that they were still alive, their families petitioned the British Columbia Supreme Court to have the couple legally presumed dead. But while the Masees could still not be found, there would be a major development in another case in 2006, when Fred Hoffman was discovered to be living in Tasmania, Australia, under the pseudonym Piet Cornelius Walters. After initially fleeing Canada in order to return to the Netherlands, Hoffman eventually relocated down under and became the director of an accountancy practice under his new identity. However, he used this opportunity to obtain unsecured loans from 118 investors and proceeded to defraud them out of nearly $1 million. Once Hoffman was caught, he was arrested and found guilty on 14 charges of fraud, as well as an additional charge of dishonest inducement, and received an 8-year prison sentence. But as far as I can tell, he was never extradited back to Canada to face his original fraud charges, and there was nothing to indicate that Hoffman ever had any contact with the Masees while he was on the run, or that their cases were connected. In August of 2014, on the 20-year anniversary of the Masees' disappearance, Ozzy Caban did an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in which he continued to express his belief that Nick and Lisa might still be alive somewhere, as he claimed he had traced a bank account belonging to the couple in the Cayman Islands which had more than $100,000 in it. But I do not believe this lead ever went anywhere. In 2019, Nick Jr. and Tanya appeared at a North Vancouver RCMP press conference to commemorate the 25th anniversary of their father and stepmother's disappearances. In the past, the family had offered a $25,000 reward for information, but they announced that it was now being increased to $50,000. But unfortunately, this hasn't paved the way to any new leads, so after 30 years, Nick and Lisa Masee continue to remain missing persons. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So over the last month or so, I've done a number of episodes about missing persons cases in which there was a decent chance that the victim was still alive somewhere, at least for a short time after they originally disappeared. These include the disappearances of Star Palumbo, Selena Eden, and Vlada Castle, and now I suppose you can add the disappearances of Nick and Lisa Masee to that list. To be fair, it seems like the majority consensus is that the Masees became the victims of foul play, but there are some who have not hesitate to share their opinion that the couple took off voluntarily to start a new life. And unlike those other victims I just mentioned, the Masees may have had the financial means and the resources to pull something like that off. But while this may not have been an unreasonable assumption to make back in 1994, it's now been 30 years since Nick and Lisa went missing, and no conclusive evidence has ever surfaced to indicate they are still alive. It seems like the most vocal supporter of the disappeared voluntarily theory was Ozzy Caban, the private investigator hired by Nick Masee Jr., but it sounds like the two sides definitely had a difference in opinion. Ozzy Caban passed away just over 2 years ago in May of 2022 after a long career as a high-profile private investigator, and I mentioned earlier that he worked on the Cindy James case. In case you don't know the details of that story, Cindy James was a woman who claimed that she was being continually attacked and harassed by an unknown stalker throughout a period of 6.5 years, until she wound up dead under bizarre circumstances in June of 1989. The police believe that Cindy's death was an elaborate suicide and that she fabricated all these supposed attacks against her, possibly due to some serious struggles with mental illness. But of course, Cindy's family believed that the harassment was real and she was the victim of foul play, so the case continues to be shrouded in controversy to this day. When Cindy felt the police could no longer help her, she hired Ozzy Caban in order to catch her so-called stalker, but while he was unable to do so, he still found it hard to believe that she could have inflicted all these attacks on herself or taken her own life. It seems apparent that Caban was not someone who always stuck to the same narrative as the police, and that certainly rings true in the Masee case. Even as late as 2014, he was publicly pushing forward the idea that the couple was still alive somewhere in some exotic location and had a secret bank account, but no evidence has ever been found to support this. I mentioned earlier that Caban once said that Nick Masee and Fred Hoffman were probably living it up together on a beach somewhere, but we know Hoffman was eventually found alive in Australia, and it's unlikely that his disappearance had anything to do with this case. Now, it is true that during his time working as an account manager with the Bank of Montreal, Nick Masee crossed paths and did business with a lot of shady characters, some of whom are stock promoters on the Vancouver Stock Exchange. You could probably do an entire podcast series about the immense corruption surrounding the VSE, as a number of key players involved with them would wind up going to prison or fleeing the country, or even becoming the victims of foul play. But the thing about Nick is that even though he spent a lot of time dealing with individuals who performed shady or illegal activities, everyone who knew him described him as being a straight shooter, and nothing has ever been found to indicate that Nick did anything illegal. Granted, it sounds like Nick enjoyed rubbing elbows with the wealthy elite, because if any of these shady characters invited him to lavish parties or social events, he would not hesitate to go. Yet it sounds like he did an effective job at skirting the line and not breaking the law. That would probably explain why Nick never rose above having a modest middle-class lifestyle, as he was making around $80,000 to $85,000 per year when he retired from the Bank of Montreal. That's still a pretty good salary for 1994, as it would be the equivalent of around $150,000 in today's money, but it certainly didn't make him super wealthy. Even though he was done banking, Nick would start working with Turbodyne Technologies Incorporated to help produce anti-pollution devices, and I think he was probably hoping this might bring him a major financial windfall which would make him a millionaire. In fact, that could explain why he didn't seem to have any qualms about meeting this mysterious investor who seemingly appeared out of nowhere with $10 million. It's been reported that the Masees were living beyond their means and had some debt at the time of their disappearances, but while this could have given them a motive to disappear and start over, the issue is that it sounds like Nick and Lisa were very close with their respective families, who could not imagine them going 3 decades without at least getting in touch to let everyone know they were okay. It would be one thing if the couple were fugitives with active arrest warrants with the RCMP, but they were never charged with any crimes, and there's no reason for them to cut off all contact with their loved ones, particularly when you consider that Nick's 2 children were both residing in countries outside of Canada. However, let's look at the circumstances of how the Masees went missing. I do know that the RCMP sent in a request to have this case featured on Unsolved Mysteries back in the day, but this never came to fruition, which is a shame since this would have been an ideal mystery for the show. It appears their disappearances were connected to a mysterious investor from California, but all the information we have about this person is based on third-hand information which Nick and Lisa shared with other people they knew, so we've never been able to confirm if he actually existed. The story goes that this guy had previously done business with Nick while he worked for the Bank of Montreal, but Nick apparently told Lisa that he did not remember him. It seems like the original plan was for Nick to meet this guy alone, but on the afternoon of the meetup, he phoned Lisa up at work to inform her that the investor was bringing his own wife along, so he wanted Lisa to join them all for dinner. The plan was for the investor to send a limousine to pick up Nick and Lisa and join them at Nick's favorite restaurant, Trader Vic's, but no one ever showed up there, and investigators never found any evidence that a limo was sent to the Masee residence that night. On the surface, it might seem a bit naive that Nick would agree to meet with someone like this in what could have been an elaborate setup, and Lisa even told her co-workers that the whole thing sounded too good to be true. But perhaps $10 million was just too much to resist, and to be fair, the meeting was originally supposed to take place in a public restaurant, so Nick probably never thought he would be in any danger. We know that Nick made a reservation for 4 at Trader Vic's for 8:30 that night, and then phoned them up again to let them know he would be late. Since no one showed up, and Nick never formally canceled the reservation, it's reasonable to assume that something might have gone wrong shortly after Nick made that call. What complicates the situation is that we have witnesses who reported seeing Nick and Lisa between 6:30 and 10:30 p.m. that night at the Garden Lounge in the Westin Bayshore Hotel, which is where Trader Vic's also happened to be located. Since the couple were seen sharing a bottle of wine, I suppose it's possible that they were just waiting in the lounge for the investor to arrive and planned to go to Trader Vic's afterward, but if so, what happened to them next? As far as I know, Nick and Lisa were not seen in the company of anybody else, but if the investor didn't show up, did they just head back home? Why not at least use the reservation at Trader Vic's, or at the very least, call to cancel it? One detail which struck investigators as odd is that the witnesses reported seeing Nick dressed in a jogging suit, but if he was planning to have dinner with a guy who was potentially going to give him $10 million, you'd assume he would wear something much nicer. Since Nick was a regular customer at Trader Vic's, that meant he also spent a lot of time at the Westin Bayshore Hotel and likely frequented the Garden Lounge, so I think there's a good chance that even if these witnesses were correct about seeing the Masees, they might have gotten the dates mixed up and actually recalled seeing them there on a previous occasion prior to August the 10th. I definitely think there's a good chance the couple never made it to the hotel that night, and they may have been intercepted at their home. If this whole thing was a setup, I think there's a good chance this investor did not actually have a wife and just used that as an excuse in order to compel Nick to invite Lisa to their meetup. Given that Lisa worked as a hairdresser and had no involvement in Nick's business dealings, I'm not sure why the investor would need her, unless he was planning to threaten Lisa or use her as leverage in order to get Nick to do something. I have to assume that everything was completely normal when Nick made the phone call to Trader Vic's to delay his reservation, because if he was under duress at that time, it would have made more sense for him to simply cancel it. While it's easy to assume that something bad happened to the couple on the evening of the 10th, the last time Lisa was confirmed to be alive was when she made the phone calls to the hair salon and Nick's business partner Leon Nowak at around 10 a.m. on the morning of the 11th to let them know that she and Nick would be out of town for a few days. Leon found this to be especially weird since it was very out of character for Nick to have his wife make business calls like this to their office on his behalf, and Leon never heard from Nick personally and was unable to reach him. What's also strange is that Lisa made this call from Nick's cell phone, so it makes you wonder if Lisa was being forced to make these calls by an outside party in order to push forward a fake cover story about leaving town so that no one would notice the couple's absences or report their disappearance to the police for several days. And perhaps the reason Lisa had to make this call to Leon was because Nick was already dead or incapacitated at that point. It's also been reported that the calls were rerouted through the cell phone repeater on Bowen Island, which meant they may have been made from somewhere in West Vancouver rather than the Masee residence in North Vancouver. It's interesting how the Sunshine Coast Regional District was listed as a possible location where the calls could have been made, since the area is sparsely populated and has a lot of woods, so it would have been an ideal place to dispose of 2 bodies if Lisa and Nick were murdered shortly after the calls took place. When Lisa phoned Yokoi Hair Design, she claimed that she and Nick had been called out of town on a court case, but there's nothing to indicate this was true. Yes, Nick was scheduled to testify in the trial for Nelson Scalbania, but that wasn't for another 2.5 months. And since Nick was considered to be a minor witness, and this wasn't a crime in which Scalbania was ever going to receive a lengthy prison sentence, I seriously doubt that Nick would have been murdered because of it. So Lisa's remark about the court case was probably nothing but a cover story to explain why they needed to leave town on such short notice. While we're on the subject, one theory which has been pushed forward is that Nick and Lisa went missing because they became involved in something dangerous and were placed in witness protection by law enforcement for their own safety. But if that were the case, wouldn't the Masees have had to appear in court at some point in order to, testify as witnesses? I see the witness protection theory often get pushed forward in unsolved missing persons cases, but the main issue I always have with it is that these cases continue to get coverage in the media and on missing persons websites, and the same logic applies to the Masees' disappearance. If the Masees or any of these other missing persons were in witness protection and hiding out somewhere while living under new identities, wouldn't it be prudent for law enforcement to halt their investigation and stop spreading awareness about their disappearances? After all, if Nick and Lisa's photographs are being plastered everywhere, then that runs the risk of them being recognized and their lives potentially being put in danger, to say nothing of causing law enforcement to waste time and resources chasing down tips for a missing persons case that has already been resolved. Here we are 30 years later, and this case is still getting media coverage, so I think it's safe to say that if the Masees were in witness protection, their story would have faded from the spotlight a long time ago. Anyway, if the Masees did not disappear voluntarily, I think it's likely that something happened to them during the time period between Nick's phone call to Trader Vic's on the evening of August the 10th and Lisa's phone calls on the morning of August the 11th. It's possible that this so-called limousine, which was supposed to pick up the Masees, did not arrive at the residence at its scheduled time, which is why Nick made the call to postpone the reservation. But sometime afterward, this mysterious investor showed up and did something to the couple, which is why they never showed up at Trader Vic's or called them again. Hell, for all we know, maybe a limousine really did show up at the residence, but it was nothing more than a setup, and the Masees were taken to another location. But we know that at the very least, Lisa was kept alive overnight in order to make those calls the following morning. The fact that the Masees' house was unlocked, Nick's car was left unlocked in the driveway, and their cat Spider was left unfed would seem to go against the idea that the couple took off voluntarily. And even if they were looking for a fresh start, Nick had owned Spider for 17 years, and it sounds like he was pretty attached to him, so at the very least, why not take the cat along? One of the biggest pieces of evidence which goes against the theory that the Masees left the country was the fact that their passports were left behind, though I suppose it's not impossible that they could have obtained fake passports with fake names in order to take off undetected. Even though the Masee residence was left unlocked, it's never been reported that there were any signs of struggle or ransacking there, and I don't believe anything appeared to have been stolen, which may rule out robbery as being the motive for the crime. Of course, the main reason there's been speculation that Nick and Lisa were abducted from their home was the presence of zip ties near the front door. Granted, if the Masees were kidnapped, it's odd that these zip ties would be left behind at the scene, but it's possible their abductors could have been carrying an extra pair on them that they accidentally dropped. In case you're wondering, I have read a couple of unsubstantiated comments online that DNA testing was performed on the zip ties, but it turned up nothing. Regardless, if the Masees were abducted and murdered, what could the motive have been? Well, even though I have a hard time believing that the Masees disappeared voluntarily, there were definitely warning signs that something unusual was going on in their lives. I think one of the main reasons this disappearing voluntarily angle gained so much traction was because the Masees took an unplanned trip to the Cayman Islands in April of 1994, 4 months before they disappeared, in order to open up a new bank account and draw up new wills. The Masees never told anyone they were going to take this trip beforehand, but Nick did tell his daughter Tanya that he would be out of town for her birthday and unable to call her. The couple had also taken a vacation to stay in their condo in Maui just a few months earlier, so what was so important that they had to visit the Caymans at this particular time? According to Tanya, her father always loved to talk about everything that was going on in his life, but he became a lot more guarded in the months prior to his disappearance, as if there was something he didn't want to talk about. And while drawing up new wills could be a sign that Nick and Lisa suspected their lives were in danger and were making preparations in case something happened to them. But of course, these new wills don't help too much if the decedents simply vanish without a trace and their loved ones have to wait several years before they can legally declare them dead. It's also been reported that Nick attended a friend's funeral the day before he went missing and mentioned that he was planning to leave town, and he apparently looked distraught. But if Nick was becoming a lot more guarded and paranoid that his life might be in danger, it seems odd to me that he would agree to a meetup with an alleged former business colleague he did not even remember, who was potentially going to offer him $10 million to invest. Like I mentioned earlier, that sounds like an elaborate setup if I ever heard one. Another theory which was pushed forward was that Nick was murdered by a biker gang because one of his clients, Harry Mall, had gotten himself in way over his head with gambling debts, and Nick gave them a guarantee that they would be paid off. Harry Mall passed away in 2019, and he is considered to be one of the sketchiest figures ever associated with the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Following the scandal with the Pine Ridge Capital Corporation, Mall relocated to the Cayman Islands and would have been living there at the time the Masees made their unscheduled trip. But let's not forget that Mall was such a toxic figure at this point that before he was allowed to work at Turbodyne, Nick had to sign an undertaking offering assurances that he would have nothing to do with Mall. I really don't see Nick putting his life on the line to save this guy from gambling debts, but I do wonder if the Masees' disappearance occurred because Nick became embroiled in something we don't know about. Since Canadian law enforcement is known for being more stringent than American law enforcement when it comes to withholding details about unsolved cold cases, I would be curious to know what information they might have about this case which has never been publicly released. One detail I'm really curious about is whether the RCMP has any record of communications between Nick and the mysterious $10 million investor. They were able to establish that Lisa made her final calls from Nick's cell phone, so that obviously means that they had access to his phone records. Surely if Nick made all these arrangements to meet this guy, they would have spoken on the phone at some point, or was all their interaction done face-to-face? If investigators have checked Nick's phone records, were there any callers listed whose identities have never been accounted for? Technically, we only have Nick's word that someone wanted to speak with him about a potential $10 million investment, and there are no outside witnesses to corroborate this, so for all we know, maybe this is just a cover story for something else that was going on. But we do know that Nick did make a reservation at Trader Vic's on the evening of the 10th, and asked Lisa to accompany him there, and if there was something dangerous going on, I'm not sure why he would involve his wife. It's never been reported that any money belonging to the Masees went missing around the same time they did, as their bank accounts were never touched. But I do have to harken back to the fact that while Nick lived a middle-class lifestyle, he spent a lot of time hobnobbing with the wealthy elite, so someone could have been under the mistaken impression that he was a lot richer than he actually was. If this whole deal with the investor was a setup, someone could have been planning a kidnapping or extortion plot to gain access to Nick's money, but became disappointed when they found out he had much less of it than they were expecting. So in response, Nick and Lisa were murdered and their bodies were disposed of. I don't know, it just feels like we're missing a large piece of the puzzle here, and even if Nick did have a reputation as a straight arrow who never would have broken the law, I have to think there was something going on in his life which he didn't tell people about. If this mysterious investor did exist, then I definitely think there's a good chance that he was responsible for what happened to the Masees, but I really have no idea who could have been involved or what the motive was. While I would like to believe that Nick and Lisa are still alive and have spent the past 30 years living it up in some tropical paradise like the Cayman Islands, I have serious doubts about that and believe that foul play took place. But perhaps someone out there knows the truth about what happened and could break the case wide open if they came forward with what they know. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of Nick and Lisa Masee, please contact the North Vancouver Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at 604-985-1311. That's 604-985-1311. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Maria Gabriella for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for 7 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Podcast to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a very odd story from Unsolved Mysteries involving a young mute woman named Lucy, who who was discovered to be wandering the streets of California in 1992 with no information about who she was, and as far as I can tell, she was never identified. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover an unsolved cold case from Massachusetts, the 1995 murder of Deanna Kremen. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I wanted to remind anyone that in just under 1 month from now, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is taking place in North Adams, Massachusetts from October the 18th until the 20th. It's being organized by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and will feature a number of high-profile shows, including yours truly. If you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website, berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use our specialized promo code, COLE2024, to get a 35% discount on tickets. That's berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use the promo code, COLE2024, to get a 35% discount. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or any of the major podcasting platforms. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Thank you.